My name is Andrew Finn. This is Positive Television Network. I'm talking today with Roland Tembo Hendel from Sonoma County, California, who's the owner of a very remarkable dog named Odin. Roland, good morning.
Good morning, Andrew. It's nice to be here with you.
Tell us about Odin. How did this dog come into your life?
Odin came into our life with his sister. They are Great Pyrenees. We got them as puppies to be livestock guardian dogs for our little herd of goats. We got the goats several months earlier, also as babies, with the exception of Aurora, the mother of two of the boys. We got the goats as pets and to help us manage our land. They clear the brush and they eat all of the unwanted vegetation, and they do it all without using any chemistry.
How old is Odin now?
Odin and Tessa are both about a year and a half old. We still refer to them as the puppies, in contrast with the other dogs that we have on the property.
So he's not so old.
No, they're still just puppies. It's hard to believe. It's a very large breed.
That just makes his story even more amazing.
Yes, it is hard to believe. It is hard to believe. And I've watched them sort of grow up very, very fast. I've watched those instincts, those guardian instincts kick in very, very quickly from the fumbling little bumbling puppies that they were, really just a few months ago.
Roland, a lot of people would have seen the incredible footage from a Sonoma County police car driving down the road that your property is on.
Yes, Andrew, that police car drove exactly down my road and right by my place. If you see in the video, there is a fence on the right-hand side, a wooden fence. That fence was made by my neighbor just earlier this year. My property is the one immediately preceding that fence. The days are all a blur now. It was so that would have been Sunday night. Um, that was maybe half an hour or less after we had left. In fact, I believe I recall that police cruiser. There were two police cruisers who passed us going down the road at a very high speed when we were evacuating. And so I imagine that footage was taken by one of those two cars. In fact, our neighbor, just a little bit further up the road and on the left, I learned just 2 days ago, perished in those flames.
It is astonishing to think that anyone or anything living could have survived that kind of scene.
That's certainly the case, Andrew. Every once in a while, we still try to wrap our heads around certain incongruities. I had a 2,700-gallon water tank on the property that was very close to where we found the goats and Odin when we returned, and that water tank has melted. And it's hard to imagine how a thick-walled plastic container holding 2,700 gallons of cold water could have melted.
Roland, can you talk us through the lead up to your family leaving the property?
Yes, again, it's a little bit of a blur. It started with, we had a very nice evening. We had a barbecue. It was a Sunday night. It was our routine on Sunday nights to have a barbecue and sort of wind things down early and everybody get ready for the week. And we had wrapped up, and my friends Scott and Stephen, who live on the east end of the property, had gone off to bed. Originally, I got a call from my neighbor who said that he smelled smoke. So I went outside and I smelled smoke too, but it wasn't very strong. I checked CAL FIRE on my laptop. I have a browser tab open where I can check active fires. There were none. Went outside again, and I certainly could smell smoke. So I woke my daughter and told her to, I said, "Oh, we smell smoke. You know the drill. Start getting ready in case we have to evacuate. And I went outside and got on my ATV and drove up and down all of my own roads on my property to see if I could see anything, if there's any evidence of a fire, or if I could find out what direction it was coming from. And I didn't find anything, but when I came back down my mountain road, I could see the beginnings of falling ash, and I could smell smoke more strongly. And at that moment, I felt nervous about being separated from my daughter. So I drove back to the house and told my daughter that yeah, we smell smoke. You have to get dressed. I went down to the other end of the property. Stephen had already woken up and was standing by the road and asking if I smelled smoke. Of course I did, and I went to the end of the road to tell Scott to wake up. He was asleep. So I shouted at him to wake up and get his dog and get in his truck and meet us at the house. And I raced back to Ariel in the main house, and I went up on the roof. I had said I would call my neighbor, and I was calling my neighbor, looking out at the sky, and it was turning orange. It's very difficult to I don't know how to look at something like that and know how far away the fire is at first. But when I got through to my neighbor, he said that he could see fire on the corner of his property and he was leaving right now. And at that point, I could also see flames. It wasn't just orange, it was flames. And it wasn't in one of the far valleys, it was across our valley. As I stood there trying to get my head around what was happening, I could see the flames getting bigger. So I ran downstairs to Ariel. Ariel had already started loading our pets. By the time I made it outside, the winds were going mad. The winds were going in every direction, and large bits of ash were falling. And at that point, it was clear that it was absolutely critical that we leave immediately, and that seconds, that minutes, seconds counted, and we were evacuating. We had our dog Jezebel and our dog Tessa, and Tessa is Odin's sister, loaded into the car along with the cat, who was in a carrier. Stephen and Scott had Tugboat and Kiki, so their dog and cat, respectively, loaded into their truck. And I went to tend to the goats and Odin. There was clearly no time to try to corral the goats into a trailer and hitch them to the truck. I couldn't do that in less than 20 minutes in the best of circumstances. I walked through the gate where the goats were all in a tight group, which is what they do when Odin alerts them to danger, or Tessa alerts them to danger. They get into a tight group. And Odin was walking back and forth in front of them. As I walked up, he was clearly on alert. His tail wasn't wagging, but his tail was moving back and forth. And as I walked up, I said, "Okay, Odin, let's go." And he sat down and looked at me square in the eye. And I've seen that before. He's a very good dog. It would be incorrect to call him disobedient, but he is his own dog, and that particular breed, they're not a breed to do tricks. They are specifically bred to guard livestock. And he sat down squarely and looked at me, and I knew I wasn't moving him. He's done that to me before when I've tried to take him away from the goats at night. And he was much younger the last time I tried that, and it was very difficult. So he sat down, and it was very clear he was going nowhere. So I said, "Okay, Odin, you take care of the goats then, and we'll be back to get you." And I ran down the hill to open the other gate to that pasture, and then from there through the pasture to the far gate to open that so that they had an escape path. And then I ran back to the car, and my daughter said, "Where's Odin?" And I said, Ariel, Odin's not coming. And she knew what I meant. And we got in the car, and we drove down my road to the gate. As ash was falling, and we could hear the sound of propane tanks exploding on our neighbor's property now. And the sky was getting light. We got onto the main mountain road, and we drove down the main road, and we spent the next several hours driving, trying to find safety.
When you said goodbye to Odin, or you told your daughter what had happened, did you have any thought that you would see him again, or were you just in survival mode?
Yes, to both of those. We were certainly in survival mode, but you hold on to hope. You hold on to hope that the fire isn't where you think it is, that the fire will go in a different direction, that somehow this impossible thing couldn't possibly be happening.
You spent a couple of hours getting to safety, so you would now be in the middle of the night, in the very early hours of Monday morning.
Yes. We first drove down our road and found where a bunch of other neighbors had gathered, and we stopped there. People were in a panic, especially for people who were left behind. A county sheriff drove down the road at a very high speed and stopped in front of us and stuck his head out the window and screamed, "Get out of here," and waved in the direction we were meant to go. Another cruiser pulling up very fast behind him. So we all got back in our cars and drove in the direction he indicated. We collected next at a large parking lot, our closest parking lot, where there's a little shopping mall. A bunch of neighbors had gathered there, but it didn't take long before that fire started coming down the mountain, and that's about 15 minutes from my house. Sitting in that parking lot, and then at a friend of my daughter's house who's very close to there, we could see again that sky turning orange, and then we heard the sound of distant explosions, and those explosions getting closer, and the twisting metal of transmission towers collapsing. That was the most eerie for me. That sound of, it sounded like bridges falling, even though there are no bridges where we live. We thought we'd drive to the airport, so we drove north. We saw the fires coming from the north, so we tried driving south. And as we were driving in the southbound lanes on the freeway, we saw cars coming northbound in our lanes, and that's not a good feeling when people are so panicked that they'll drive the wrong way down the freeway. So we headed east, which was our last. We had come from the west, so we headed east. That was our last option, and we drove through a subdivision that is now no longer there, called Coffee Park, that has been completely wiped out. And from there, we were able to drive southeast to get to Sebastopol, which is from where I'm calling you today. It was, I believe, after 2 by the time we made it here, where a friend had arranged to accommodate us. I can't really remember what happened after we got here, except that the smell of smoke was very strong, and you could still see the sky was orange coming from the west. So we all kind of went to bed. I don't know if anybody slept. My daughter did, which was a blessing. But I certainly didn't sleep because I could still, all night, I could still hear the sound of exploding propane tanks. And I felt I needed to be ready to evacuate again if the fires came to where we were. Quite fortunately for us, they didn't. And we've been safe. We've been relatively safe ever since.
When was the first moment that you felt safe? You wouldn't have to move again that night?
I think the answer was the next day. When we had woken up, the smell of smoke was very strong. I remember getting in the truck to make our way back to the property, and the sun was sort of aligned beside a red stoplight, and they looked almost the same as the sun was sort of covered. There was so much ash and smoke in the sky; it's very strong. But at that point, at least we were awake and we were mobile and we could move very quickly. So I think the next time I really felt safe was when we were in the car.
What's going through your mind that morning? Do you have any information about neighbors or loved ones who live close to you?
I did. I was in contact with several neighbors, most of whom evacuated, one of whom stayed behind. So I was able to contact my most immediate neighbors, and everybody was okay. What was on my mind, what was on our minds at that point was really Odin and the goats who had been left behind, and how we were going to get back to the property, and if we could get back to the property, and what had happened to them, and what we could do for them. Um, now that we were safe, relatively safe.
When you ended up in Sebastopol, how long of a drive is that from your property?
It's, I think, about 40 or 45 minutes without traffic.
So it's Monday, and are you already thinking about going back, or is that happening on Tuesday?
I believe we went back on Tuesday. It's a blur. I would have to check my Facebook page. But I believe we did not go back the next day. The roads were a mess. Power was out everywhere. So I believe the next day we found ourselves pretty immobilized. Unless it was an emergency, the roads were really being used by emergency crews, fire trucks and police cars.
So it's Tuesday, and sometime in the day you head back. You must have had quite a strong mix of emotions going on.
Yes, yes. You still hold on to an odd hope that that everything is going to be okay. Somehow, the fire spared you. We did have a fire protection strategy. We had a fire break around our home that was about 25 yards of cleared land. There were some trees, but the land around the home is cleared specifically to try to protect it from fire. So we were holding on to some hope that perhaps the fire had spared us. We headed out, and all roads into that area were blocked by police. So we tried several ways to get in. We finally tried to come in from the north. People normally never would. It's all through rural roads, and we found a roadblock there too. Uh, but the sheriff on that first day I think he was so overwhelmed that when we pulled up, he said, "I can't let you through." And we said, "We have to see we have to go see our dog and livestock." And he said, "Well, um, I'm not going to arrest you, but I can't let you through." And I think we understood what he meant. So we drove through that roadblock, made our way towards our home, and as we got closer, there were a lot of fallen trees. This is one of those things. Please don't try this at home. But we lifted the pole that the power line was attached to, so that the power line would lie flat across the road. I was quite sure that there was no power running through it. We were able to drive over it, and we made it to the front gate of my property. We turned onto the road behind the gate. It was very clear that our forest did not survive that fire. Everything was black. There was smoke, and there was smoke coming up from pockets everywhere on the land. Some of the trees were still on fire. There were little spot fires still burning on the property. And as we made our way down the road to the house, it was pretty clear that any optimism that we had been spared was misplaced. First, we saw our trucks, which had burned and melted. There were these rivulets, these 25-foot rivulets of melted aluminum that had poured from where the trucks were down across the road. And the trucks were sitting, I guess the wheels had melted and they were burned out. And just beyond that is where you would see the house, which was no longer there. It was sort of a 3.5-story home hand built by the previous owner. It was sort of built in the manner of a Buddhist temple, and that house was gone. It was just rubble. And just sort of at that point, we could see in the pasture. We could just sort of make out that the white and brown and black shapes of the goats, and as we kept driving, we could see Odin's tail wagging. So we drove up to close to the pasture, and I jumped out of the car and ran up to Odin, who was wagging his tail and happy to see me, and licking my face and obviously weak, but trying to jump on me and jump on me with his paws. And the goats were all bowing. They were all making the greeting sound they make when they're whenever we would go to feed them in the mornings. They all made the familiar sound. In all of that black landscape with smoke everywhere and everything gone, yeah, there was Odin and the goats. It was incongruous. There had been several times when I had asked myself, is this really happening? Is this really happening? And by this point, I had to check again. All 8 goats were accounted for, every single one. And they were not in poor health. They were covered in soot, but they didn't have any blood around their noses. I checked their hooves. Their hooves were fine. Odie looked good. He was limping, and his whiskers were melted, and his eyelashes or his eyelash whiskers were melted, and he was limping, and he was weak, and his eyes were squinting, because I guess from just from all the smoke in the air. But he lay down on his back and rolled over and wanted us to rub his belly, and so I got to do a good inspection of him, and he seemed in fairly good health, and they still had water, a water trough that was not filled with the best water, so they still had water. It's just odd how things happen. It was only 20 feet from the water container that melted, and it has a wooden stand, and for some reason that wooden stand didn't burn. I hadn't thought about that until just this moment. But they still had water, and there were several small deer. When we came up the road, there were, I recall seeing 5, maybe as many as 6 small deer that had gathered around Odin and the goats. The goats acted like it was no big deal. They had lived with them all their lives, and the goats and the deer were sort of huddled around Odin. One of them was drinking from the trough as we pulled up, and they sort of scattered as we got closer. But that sort of just added to the incomprehensibility of what we saw at that moment.
Truly astonishing, Roland.
It's quite something to think back on. I think it's going to be a long time before I finish sort of processing this, and I can remember this without feeling a little bit lost and confused, and certainly a whole lot of emotional.
I'm just showing some images now of what kind of shape Odin was in when you found him. What had happened to his coat? How did he look different?
Oh yes, his coat had been singed orange. He has a long white fur, and his coat had been singed orange, so he looked quite a bit smaller than usual. He didn't have any burns. There was no blackness, just sort of orange, and his fur was shorter. His whiskers were all On one side, they're melted down to nubs, about a quarter-inch long, and on the other side, they're melted and all curled up. And his eyebrow whiskers are all missing. And as I said, he was limping and squinting, and clearly very, very tired, very exhausted, but not so exhausted that he didn't try to jump on us, which he wasn't supposed to do. He wasn't supposed to jump on us, but he not so exhausted he didn't try to jump on us and kissed us, and he looked very glad to see us, and if anything, he looked quite pleased with himself. He looked like, he was, we were telling him what a good boy he was and what a brave boy he was, and he looked, he really looked quite pleased with himself.
Do you have any idea how he did it?
So, I do. I've learned a little bit since then about how these fires operate, and I think they move around a lot, and they sort of, you can get lucky and they spare some areas because there are some odd things on the land that are untouched by fire. And there's a large rock outcropping in the middle of a pasture that the goats had cleared. They used to play on those rocks when they were little, the goats. They still do now. And when Odin alerts them, or Tessa alerts them to danger, the goats all pop up on these rocks. It's quite something. Odin has several different barks, and Tessa has several different barks for different, they're just a threatening bark or a alarm bark or a signaling bark. They have all these different barks, and when it's a serious one, all the goats pop up on the rocks. And they're about 5 or 6 feet high, and they're sort of scattered about in a little bit of a circle in this pasture. And I think what Odin did was he herded them all into in the middle of that rock outcropping, which would have provided them some shelter from the direct flames. And I could see that there were a lot of goat and deer droppings in the middle of that circle, whereas any of the goat droppings that were on the land had been burned. So if I had to guess, I would think that that's what he did, and perhaps and several deer as well were sheltered in that rock outcropping until the worst of it had passed. But clearly Odin had been affected by his coat on both sides had been singed just by the intense heat of that fire, but spared from the direct flames.
It must have been some hours, if that's where they were, that they had to shelter there.
I can only imagine. The house was burned, so it was again a multi-storied home, and it burned right to the foundation. The washing and drying machine burned. The water heater burned. I had a safe. It melted. That fire must have been very intense and must have been burning for a long time, as well as the forest around us. Every other structure on the property, all of the barns, the studio that I thought might one day be my daughter's a place where she could work and where we could, until then, my friends and I could do design work. My workshop, my friend's Airstream, equipment, and trucks on parts of the property. Absolutely everything was burned. All of the brush up the slope of the mountain is gone. The redwoods remain standing. This is actually a good thing for redwoods. It's part of their survival strategy to be able to survive fires and have their competition eliminated. So they're standing strong. But I cannot imagine how long that fire burned. I cannot imagine how hot it was. I can just tell you that it burned up nearly everything. On nearly everything. must have been thousands of tons of fuel in my forest burned. Thousands of tons of wood. 35 acres of forest was wiped out.
So you'd found Odin and the goats. How did you get them out of there? The area wasn't exactly safe.
The real challenge was one, we didn't have a trailer anymore, and two, the roads were blocked in, and in fact, I believe they are blocked in to this day. The roadblocks remain up. So the next challenge was to evacuate the animals, and actually, for a period of a day and a half, they went missing. They just disappeared from the property, and our hearts sank once again. And we went out to the property to look for them. They went missing in the evening of on the evening Wednesday evening, and then Thursday they had gone missing, and Friday was the second day we went out to look for them. You know, our hearts had fallen. We didn't know where they were. I'd searched all over the property. My neighbor had helped search. People were looking for them. We went back to set up a sort of base on the property from where, from which we would go out and search. And they were back there again, miraculously again, right where we had found them the first time. So it was a very similar scene to the first time. Odin was happy to see us. He was doing a little bit better. He had been reunited with his sister Tessa by then. We dropped his sister off the day before. And this time we had an evacuation plan. By this time, people had mobilized, and the shelter had been set up. And we were so excited to see them all again. And now we felt we were going to be able to get them out safely. The challenge was there was no cell reception on my land. The towers had all been knocked out. So I drove to my neighbors, the same neighbor who was checking in on the animals and helped get them food and water in the preceding days. I drove to my neighbors where I did get some cell reception, but the police officers, no longer sheriffs, the highway patrol officers who ran the roadblocks would not let the evac team we had arranged through to pick the animals up. So, the first challenge was finding them alive after the fires, and the second challenge was finding them again after they had disappeared. And now this third challenge was, once again, we had no way to get them out. I wasn't going to leave them alone. We weren't going to leave them alone on the property a third time. So I left my daughter and Scott with the goats and the dogs, and I got in the car to see what we could do. I eventually gave up on the evac coming through because I just couldn't. Cell phone reception was too poor, and I couldn't seem to get all the different agencies to let the trailer through. So a neighbor said that they had an old trailer that was up on some preservation land that might have survived. So I drove up to find that trailer. I found the trailer intact. It had air in the tires and it rolled. There's an African safari that is at the bottom of the hill. I drove down to the safari and they were there, and I knew they had a workshop. So I asked them if I could borrow a ball hitch for the truck, and they lent me one. And we sort of set up a plan. And I drove back up the mountain. I hitched up to that trailer. We pulled it down to the workshop. We put a roof on it and a front on it and fixed up some things that didn't work. And just as it was beginning to get dark, I drove that rickety trailer back to my property. Ariel and Scott were exactly walking away. They didn't know where I had gone. I wasn't able to reach them. They had been there for several hours by now. They were just walking down the driveway to make it to my neighbor's house, if you can believe that. And just as I was pulling in, and boy, I don't know that I've ever felt so proud as when my daughter saw me coming up the road with this beat up trailer. I could see that she was. I could see that look in her eye that said, "Oh, I knew my dad would come through." So we drove that trailer. We drove that trailer up, and the people at the safari gave me some sweet meal, which is this So the goats just love sweet meal, grains and corn and molasses. My daughter poured that sweet meal in the front of the trailer, and we latched it up, and the goats all popped in, and we lifted poor Odie into the back of the truck, and we drove out of there, and we drove down the road and past the roadblock and back to where there was cell phone reception. We called the Sonoma County Fairgrounds, and they gave us instructions on where to go and what to do. And we pulled up to the gate of the Sonoma County Fairgrounds. It was past dark by now. It was well past dark, and the volunteers there, they came and gave me a hug. By this point, I could barely stand. Mostly just from the emotions, from the emotional weight of everything, and they recognized that and kind of held me up and gave me water, and they were so kind. They knew exactly what to do. And they sheltered us they set up a barn for us. People began running around in all directions, and they set up a barn for us. And we pulled up with that rickety trailer, and Ariel took Odin into the barn, and he sat down in at one end of the barn, and we opened up the gate, and all the goats walked out of the trailer and into the barn where Odin and Tessa were, and they were safe. And they were safe. That was the first time that we knew they were safe. And they've been safe ever since. And boy, we slept. I slept last night. I slept that night. That might have been the best night's sleep I ever had.
Thank you, Roland.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Andrew.
Roland Tembo Hendel, thank you so much for sharing this incredible story. I just ask you what the community response has been.
At this point, with everybody safe, that has been really the overwhelming experience that we're living right at this moment. The community has come together. It's always been a tight knit community, not just up in the mountains where I live. I'm saying that present tense, but the mountains were my home. Where we're going to rebuild our home, but also here in the towns. It's always been a close community, but it is absolutely exceptional. There are signs up everywhere saying Sonoma's strong, and thanks for giving thanks to first responders. Everybody, there is just a sense that everybody is so very glad to be alive, and when that's what you're feeling, when what you're feeling, and in the moment is gratitude, is just gratitude that you're alive. It comes very naturally to be kind to one another. It doesn't occur to you be anything but kind to one another when you feel that kind of gratitude, or even when you're feeling that kind of grief and loss. The community has come together in every way I could imagine, in very personal ways, across social media, the outpouring of love and support. We started a U-Caring site to collect funds so that we could quickly reestablish a safe habitat for our herd and for Odin and Tessa, and we were overwhelmed. I'm trying to I'm trying to figure out how to manage the overflow of funds that we got on our crowdfunding site. And what's really emerged from this is that Odin has become this source of inspiration and hope to people at a time when we really need it. And so I'm in this position of receiving. We're all receiving so much compassion and support and help, and and everything, having all of our needs met from the community, all of our needs met, and also trying to give back, trying to share Odin's story and give back to all the people who've reached out to, because they want to hear about him, or just give him their blessing and tell us how thankful they are for Odin, and how inspired they are for Odin. So it's been tremendous. And I'll say we lost all of our property except for what was in our pockets, but we didn't lose any of our lives. And I don't know that I've ever felt. I don't know that I've ever felt more joyful. I don't know that I've ever felt more gratitude and more unencumbered and just more happy to be alive. I can't remember feeling that. The last time I really felt this so strongly was probably when my daughter was born. It's really, in spite of all of this, it's quite a wonderful feeling. And I have to stop and remind myself sometimes that people have lost their lives, and they do not have the opportunity to feel the way I do now, with everybody safe. So I feel a tremendous. I really do feel tremendous gratitude, and that is because of the community, the support of the community. It's amazing how we can come together, when we allow ourselves to.
Roland, thank you again so very much.
You're very welcome, Andrew. It was a pleasure talking to you.
This is Positive TV News.
For follow-up stories on Odin and his family, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Thanks.